I recently sat down to finally watch the Ducktales reboot, and I was surprised by just how much I actually enjoyed it. I liked what I saw of the original series when I was a kid, but as most of you can see from the shows we cover and the topics we dive into on this channel, I tend to enjoy shows with more serious overarching elements that help develop characters in meaningful and emotional ways. And while Ducktales prefers to spend most of its time on more nonsensical plots and funny antics that the characters can get into, it has found a balance by providing an overarching plot each season that serves as its emotional backbone. In Season 1, of course, we didn't quite know this yet, though. Several ideas were presented early on that became recurring plotlines, but until we saw the resolution of them, we didn't know if they were going to be continuity for the sake of continuity, or if they were actually going to have consequences. In the season finale, Shadow Wars, we get an answer to that, and that is what makes it one of the best episodes, if not the best episode in the entire series. You see, you can have continuity without consequences. Each season of the show, for instance, tends to focus on one of the triplets developing who they are in relation to a personal plotline. Season 1 had Dewey trying to solve the mystery of his mother. Season 2 had Louie learning what it means to really be a businessman, as well as establishing a balance with his own way of doing things that the others consider not to be wise. And Season 3 seems to be having some focus on Huey, but it is hard to say exactly where it's going, or if it will get the full attention it needs, with this season being so short. All of these plots have continuity. They are referenced from one episode to the next, but they don't actually have consequences. Dewey solves the mystery of his mother's disappearance by getting Scrooge to admit to what happened, but there is nothing he is able to do with that information, so he essentially gives up, with the return of Della Duck being her own story motivated by her own actions. Louie seemingly grew as a character, but through Season 3 we haven't seen it really affect him or the balance he has with the other characters in any way. Neither of these stories had any consequences. And that brings us to the Shadow War, where Webby and Lena's plotline comes to its own climax, and we see that it has very physical consequences, but absolutely ignores the possibility of emotional ones. While Lena was not a starring character on the show, she seemed to have a similar level of importance as other side characters that recurred, but she was the first one to ever seemingly be written out of the show. In children's shows, you are often not able to kill off major characters without upsetting the network or some censors, so they often find creative solutions to write out a character in a way that is equivalent to death within the show, such as in this case where Lena is sent to the Shadow Dimension. Lena is first introduced as a friend to Webby, but it becomes clear to the audience that she is just using Webby to help someone with a grudge against Scrooge McDuck. Her emotional arc for the season was realizing that she really did care about Webby, and then regretting her decision to help her Aunt Magica use her. In the end, Aunt Magica is too powerful and takes complete control of Lena. This reaches a head in the season finale, where Magica returns to her physical form and tries to attack Webby. What remains of Lena in her shadow form jumps in the way and ends up getting hurt instead, leaving her permanently in the shadow dimension, which is perhaps as close to an on-screen character death the show was allowed to have. The problem was that the show didn't follow up with emotional consequences. Removing a character is a physical consequence, but without an emotional response to it, all you've done is set up a new norm that doesn't include that character. It is certainly an interesting development, which makes this finale one of the best episodes out there, but it does fail to resonate when Webby isn't given the appropriate time to grieve. After Magica is defeated, we get a scene trying to show Webby's feelings on the matter, but it is only given an abysmal 20 seconds to do so, and I can't imagine a worse way to have executed it in that time. Webby is sad, of course, and the triplets do virtually nothing to comfort her beyond just acknowledging what happened and then giving her the most simplistic platitude in the world, that she will always be with you. At the time, this seemed to be a permanent change to the show, and the way they handled it before turning Webby back into a perfectly happy girl seemed to belittle that change. Most shows find other ways to deal with a character's death in an equal amount of time. The The most common is to not address it until the end of the episode, by having all the characters pay their respects to her in some way, an indication that even if we don't see it on screen, the characters will always be mourning that loss internally. Ducktales had other plans for their final few minutes of the episode, of course, with other plot lines that needed resolving, like Scrooge making up with the boys, or confirming that Della was in fact still alive. But even with only 20 seconds, the show could have done a better job of highlighting the emotional consequences for this. Instead of having Webby comforted to such a point that she has no problem acting like literally nothing happened immediately after, the boys could have had their moment with Scrooge by themselves, with Webby in the background being comforted by her granny, so that we see she isn't going to immediately get over this. Despite this issue, the fact that Lena was seemingly written out of the show actually made it one of the best in the series, if not the best in the series at the time that it had aired. But it made room for the worst episode in the series, which directly followed up on these plotlines. This episode is Friendship Hates Magic, a Season 2 episode that comes halfway through the season, and up until this point, Webby is seen acting entirely normal, as if the events of the Season 1 finale and Lena's seeming death had no effect on her. There were physical consequences in the continuity because now Lena just wasn't there, but there were no emotional consequences, as Webby herself remained unchanged. In this episode, Webby is doing research to try and find a way to bring Lena back, and we actually see that Lena is still following her around in Webby's shadow from her perspective. The episode builds this great narrative of Webby finally making a new friend who might replace Lena in some ways, but dealing with the anxiety of this new friend meeting the same fate. Lena, meanwhile, is having to deal with the fact that Webby may be moving on, and has to stop using the idea that she is protecting Webby as an excuse for not letting Webby replace her. Up until the final moments, it seems like we're not just seeing the emotional consequences of Lena's death, but are being given closure to both of their stories in a very nuanced way. That is, until the very last minute where Lena is brought back from the shadow dimension, and it is such a non-issue that they don't even have any follow-up about everyone else discovering that Lena is back. They just treat it like nothing from the Shadow Wars ever actually happened. Once again, the show missed its chance to show true emotional consequences for a story, as well as give us closure we need to make Lena's loss in the season finale feel impactful, with Webby getting a new friend marking a physical change that is inspired by the emotional changes inside of her, as opposed to an emotional change inspired by just the physical one. But in the end, we just got a new friend for the sake of a new friend, because the old friend has returned as well. And that is ultimately what makes it the worst episode of the Ducktales reboot, at least so far. One that doesn't just undermine its own potential, but also the potential of the show as a whole, by erasing what little they did to showcase real-world consequences associated with their continuity. As of now, it's hard to say whether or not this will change, but it's beginning to cause a bit of a problem for the show. The cast of DuckTales is ever growing, with so many side characters being added that make the event episodes very epic by their inclusion, but also make the subplots of each season feel a bit bloated, something very noticeable in Season 3, where a lot of these characters haven't returned because of how short the season is. Developing your world doesn't just mean building it. It doesn't mean just adding characters. It also means destroying parts of it, and watching the characters that remain deal with the consequences of that, and how it changes their world as a whole, and for now, that is something that DuckTales seems unwilling to do.